This really is about connecting matters, value creation and the IoT. Let me introduce our panelists, and they're going to continue our conversation. Jeff Kaplan, welcome. Jeff is the founder of Think Strategies. For folks who don't know them, they're really a thought leader in evangelizing the IoT and the opportunities therein. And thinkstrategies.com, right? Next to him, Dave Icke. Dave is a leader in this space as well. Dave is the founding CEO of MC10. For folks who know them, they're a leader in wearable technology. They're still figuring it out. Prior to that, Dave was GM and had full P&L responsibility for a $500 million global business unit at Teradyne, so he knows a thing or two about managing change and managing people. And last but certainly not least, Brendan McSheffrey, the CEO and founder of Engage. Engage makes people safer. For lack of a better definition, I'm going to ask Brendan to talk a bit more about that, but wireless sensors to keep people safe. So why don't you start us off, Brendan? Tell a little bit about Engage, but pick up on this theme of value creation and how you are taking to heart some of Chris's comments.
Well, if Chris was a rapper, he would have dropped the mic on what he just talked about with Internet of Things. Jeff and I know, we've been to every Internet of Things conference, and that was about as good a summary as I've heard. We produce technology that monitors fire extinguishers primarily, medical oxygen defibrillators, first aid kits, other pieces of safety equipment. And we really did start from a point that is not unlike what Chris just described. My family has been in the business of manufacturing pressure gauges for over 40 years. We make mechanical pressure gauges that go on fire extinguishers, medical oxygen, fire suppression, and other devices. We decided an awfully long time ago that what we were producing was not a widget, but a little machine that produced information, and where was that information valuable? And through a long, arduous process, we are now an Internet of Things company that produces devices that generate sensor data, that sends the sensor data to the cloud, and ultimately makes people safer in buildings like this, because if we can tie in all the safety equipment, we not only reduce inspections, but we know and can alert people when there's a problem. So we really did follow a very similar process to what Chris just described, of putting the device that we had been making for a long time and looking hard at it and thinking about what is the real value there. And today we produce data streams that go to insurance companies, that go to the corporate headquarters of large retail chains so that they can monitor compliance and do scorecarding of compliance within their stores. We don't just monitor just pressure gauges where we started. We actually monitor all sorts of different sensor status, including temperature, humidity, light, barometric pressure, radiation, biological, chemical weapon sensing. And it all started with just looking hard at what goes on in and around the hundreds of there's about 110 million fire extinguishers in the US in buildings like this. In this building, there's 6 of them, give or take. And we just looked at that asset and said, what goes on from an information point of view around that asset? And when we launched Engage based on the IoT value of that.
So can I ask one question?
Absolutely.
Sure. So without revealing a secret, what's the cost of a fire extinguisher, to buy a fire extinguisher?
So a fire extinguisher, generally to install it in a building like this, about $100.
Okay, so another point for you folks, do not fall victim to the what is the value of the asset filter to decide if you should connect or instrument that asset or not. Fair?
It is fair, because our technology fully installed runs around $600. Yet the information value, if you pull a fire extinguisher off the wall, that alarm system needs to go off. And that value of that information is infinitely more valuable than the red can. The red can is really an irrelevant commodity. And in the same way, we can use the other example that we often use, our medical oxygen tracking product, where we track the location and pressure status of oxygen tanks in acute care hospitals and facilities. And the tank and pressure gauge and regulator on an oxygen tank that sits on a gurney has a cost of goods of around $32. And our monitoring technology is $450. And the ROI on that technology by reducing tank leasing is about 3-4 years. The cost of a patient having a negative outcome because of an empty oxygen tank is millions of dollars. And so making sure that you have full oxygen on a gurney is infinitely more valuable than the tank. The tank's irrelevant. The device is kind of irrelevant. The information value is what really is the fulcrum data there of that is it full, is it empty, where is it?
So great point, and I'll ask Jeff and Dave to jump in. So if you are making a decision as a CEO, decision maker, board member, and it isn't just about the cost of the particular device you're thinking about, what is a CEO, what's a board thinking about when you're making an investment in people or money in IoT? Dave?
Well, I mean, I think it gets back to, just sort of picking up on the thoughts here. There's the asset itself, but what you're really trying to do is quantify the outcome of the product or service that you're providing.
How do you do that?
The first piece is to be able to measure it continuously, sort of 24/7 outside the walls and fences, as Chris was talking about. And, we at MC10, which is a company that I led for 5 years, we were about putting sensing and computing onto and inside the human body. And if you think about when you get access to your own health information, it's really very episodic. I mean, you might step on the scale every morning, but, and diabetics are sort of one case where there's more, it's going towards continuous data monitoring. But for most healthcare cases, you're lucky if you go to your primary care physician once a year for a checkup. You get a little bit of insight into what's happening in your health. And as a result, we have a really expensive healthcare system that's very reactive and very episodic. And I think that the whole system there is trying to shift towards being able to quantify outcomes and see what really works, as opposed to just charging people fee for service. And so ubiquitous 24/7 seamless sensing and inputs into that completely changes how that can happen. And it starts with people have to understand what the real outcomes are and being able to measure them and seeing how they're different between you and me and someone else.
Can I interrupt him one more time?
You bet.
You mentioned something, maybe if you would, just rapid experimentation. Sure. Could you talk about that a little bit more? Because it sounds like, especially in healthcare, having that data set and having that ability to experiment or test rapidly.
Yeah, no. Learning cycles have to be accelerated, and having real-time access to data makes that happen much more quickly. Actually, going back to my days in the semiconductor industry, as people are building chip fabs that cost $1 billion, or now they're several $billion. It used to be that you would find out what happens on a computer chip after you've put 300 steps and 6 or 7 weeks of work into it. So you have literally millions of dollars going into a lot of semiconductor in terms of cost, and you would only find out reactively what happened. And by putting eyes and ears into what was happening every day in the fab, you could much more proactively fix things, and it turns into rapid learning cycles, quicker information turns, which allows people to improve and ramp much more quickly and get to a place of profitability before their competition.
So product development is an iterative process. Jeff, if I'm a board member thinking about this, particularly when you're talking about a consumer-driven IoT device, what about security? If I'm a board member who wants to understand upside and downside, tell me a little bit about those implications. I ask all the panel to talk about that. There are a lot of decision makers here in the audience thinking, it's great to have that data. What do I do with it? How vulnerable is it? And what's the downside of having that?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to claim to be a security expert, but on the other hand, we all know that security is a very important part of the entire supply chain, if you will, of activity that goes on with the Internet of Things. They're the primary connections that have to be secure, and the data that's collected has to be secure. I was having a conversation with someone before we got started here about the privacy issues. And if we live in a world has a dichotomy around one view versus another, there are folks who have a view that my data should be my data. I should be able to hide that data from anything around me. While there's an increasingly different point of view, which gets to Chris's point, which is that people are recognizing that data is only valuable to me, but the more I make that data available to others, the better it could be for me, whether I'm in a business where I share that data or as an individual where I share that data. And part of it is because of our consumer experiences, wearing the Fitbits, or if you're a cyclist, doing Strava or something of that nature, and what we gain from that kind of continuous access to data about ourselves and then the comparative data that we gain from others. But part of it also, from a business perspective, is saying, okay, the more data we have, the better we can manage our business, right? The more data we have and we can compare to others, the better we can compete in our markets. So there's a fine line between, there's a real tension there, and it's a continuous battle because the goal line, so to speak, continues to shift in terms of what is acceptable and what isn't. In part because skills are evolving and the technology is evolving to allow us to protect and make choices, like you were just talking about, make choices that we couldn't make before. The mechanics to make those choices are becoming more readily available.
Dave, of course, there's a Pew Research study out this morning that talks a little bit about what Jeff was saying, that most of us are very concerned about our privacy, but we can't help ourselves. We're all online. And no one wants a landline, which is the most trusted pipe for communication. Dave, when you're at MC10, how did you manage these kind of discussions about security and product building?
Yeah, I mean, it's very case specific, right? It depends on the specifics of what can be gained, and you have to be able to paint a story of compelling benefit to and a level of trust to get people to share enough data so that they can get the benefit of the greater good, networking it together, and that gets more complicated as you involve more stakeholders, right? So if you're doing a device, a wearable device for fitness, just going straight to the consumer, that's great. If you're trying to get some healthcare data about the human body and share it with a drug maker or medical device maker, as well as a healthcare provider, physician, nurse practitioner, support team, as well as potentially payers in the insurance companies in the system, then you get it quickly becomes a challenge in terms of how you manage that. So you have to start with the patient or the customer who can then opt into sharing things in a controlled way from which they'll derive some benefit. And if you can't do that, if you can't architect that, then you end up stalled, at least in my experience.
And by the way, you mentioned the word share. There's a whole new economy called the shared economy that wouldn't be possible without, first of all, this idea that there are more people who want to share things, whether it's their homes, their cars, or even their parking spaces. And new services that are coming up in San Francisco and probably going to come to Boston pretty soon about you leave your car at the airport and someone can actually use your car while you're gone and bring it back. That wouldn't be possible unless we had the right kind of sensor technology and the right kind of computing capabilities to back that up. But more importantly, the right kind of attitude that allows us to feel more comfortable day in and day out, sharing more of these resources, sharing more information about ourselves. A year or two ago, we wouldn't have even thought to do that. But now attitudinally, both as consumers and as businesses, we're thinking more and more about how we can do that to our advantage to a certain extent, and maybe also for the betterment of the world in another way.
A lot of thinking about this.
So I was born and raised in Fall River. Grandfathers were sweepers. One swept chimneys, the other swept floors. One was Army D-Day +6, carried an M1. The other was a Swabby in the Navy. I'm the product of a 3-family home environment. Work matters. Work is cool. Work is valuable. There's nothing wrong with work. And that's an East Coast attitude that isn't shared in the Valley. Let me be clear about this. I'm a homer, absolutely. but I also spend a hell of a lot of time in other environments, and I can tell you that accepting the complexity that is our lives today, especially in the physical world, matters. You know, we talk about interconnectedness, but we never finish what the story really is. There are unintended consequences to connectivity, and we know about it in social with online bullying and such. But think about what that means in a connected physical world. So, number one, I think the culture here in Boston, I know mine, is rooted in accepting the complexity, being honest about it. There are other entities that have liabilities or have opportunities that are associated with how I manage my assets. Let me go and not just help them, but let me go enable them and create value for myself. It's not charity, number one. Number two, there's tension inherent in accepting that complexity. And that tension usually shows up in, oh my God, this is going to take more time and it's going to cost more money. And I went through an amazing exercise with a division of GE, a multi-billion-dollar division of GE, and I wouldn't give up that point. Please, Tommy, I'm not using his real name, let's just go through one session with one of your sales teams to introduce them to how addressing the complexity with a method can actually accelerate the sales cycle. There is tension. The tension needs to be managed, not ignored. And the third and final point is, if you acknowledge the complexity, if you embrace or attack the tensions, that's where you will find opportunity. That's where you will find value. And that is completely antithetical to what most tech investors in Silicon Valley want. They don't want complexity, they don't want tension, and when it comes to value creation, they really are in the mode of hyper-concentrating. There is no single model for IoT. We are not going to Facebook the physical world, and if we don't get over the idea that it's going to be fragmented and it's going to require OpEx and it's going to make our hair hurt in the beginning, then we're not going to have all that value at the back end. So the last point on security is, and security is part of that sort of framework that I just gave you. There is no one answer to security. I was on a panel with Michael Capellas and retired General Harry Radke, and here's what we came up with. It's not just in the cloud that security is created, and it's not just in software that security is created. So if someone is selling you software in the cloud security, they're only giving you half the story. You need hardware security at the edge node as well. So I'll just stop with the rant. I apologize, but the reason why I'm saying
rants are okay.
There's a culture here. I think you're part of it, and it's the ability to recognize the complexity, to attack the tension, and see the opportunity. And I don't see that happening in most other major centers of technology or finance. When I'm in London, when I'm in the Valley, when I'm in Manhattan, I don't see people living that, but I do see people living that in our cluster.
Brendan, how are you dealing with that with Engage?
Well, we have a lens that we use, or a way of thinking about the Internet of Things that I think frames a lot of this. And that is, we often talk about how do we remove friction from the user experience? How do we remove friction from the experience? And from a consumer point of view, we think about it both from a B2B point of view and a consumer point of view. But from a consumer point of view, if I'm able to walk into a retail store and I'm able to, the store knows I'm in the store because I've given it permission to know. It brings up my app that is the store app. It tells me what I bought the last time I was in the store. It brings up my shopping list, brings up, oh, the last time you were in the store, you bought batteries a year and a half ago, which means they were AA, so you probably need AA's now, and it suggests that to me. It's removed a lot of friction from that experience. So in removing the friction, I'm willing to give up privacy to do that. And there's the trade-off. There has to be some value to me in order for me to give up some of my security, which many of us already do today. I know my wife certainly does with the CVS card. She's addicted to the thing. I mean, she chastised me if I buy anything at CVS without putting the number in. And that is the kind of user experience that we're going to get to, is the building knows we're in it. And we're going to choose to let the building know we're in it so that we can check in faster or do something or get something from the user experience that has made things easier. And that's how we often think about it. But I think Chris's point about hardware and software being secure is often how we have to think about things in a B2B environment. And a simple example of that is our technology monitors our devices that, oxygen tanks, fire extinguishers, et cetera. We do not affect the device. So you can't go through the cloud and turn a fire extinguisher on through our technology. You can only interrogate it and find out, is it okay? So we really create a wall between action and the cloud in order to have a secure environment with the devices we touch. So that is something that we do think about. But
okay, I want to pivot a bit to before we take some questions to financing. Dave, I'll start with you. How should decision makers who are trying to develop and hone a financing strategy think about the IoT? Does it cost more, less? How do you think about this in the context of asking a board, asking investors, asking a strategic partner for money?
Well, I mean, I think it has to start with, sort of a clear statement of the value proposition for a particular use case, right? I mean, I think the Internet of Things becomes a buzzword, and people want to try to jump on the bandwagon, right? And instead, you have to define it in a context that's going to be meaningful to solving a problem for your customer, and as opposed to having sort of a technology that you're then trying to push out to your customers. And I think if you're careful, if you start with one particular case, define it clearly, and show how a connected solution can add value. And ultimately, that's going to result in some better outcome or better cost of ownership or better utilization for the customer. So it's a net savings of dollars that will require some upfront investment, but can be monetized in different ways, right? You talked about the water as a service, right? Eliminating upfront capital cost and instead deferring that over time. That takes some guts. And it takes a clear business case to justify. But I think that the investment community is becoming more aware of the case studies of success. And as long as you define it in a way that's not trying to be all things to all people, I think you can be successful in getting the financing done.
Thoughts on that, Jeff?
A couple of thoughts. Number one, we are seeing a real surge in investment in the space. I forget the exact number, but it was somewhere around $300 million was spent or invested in IoT companies last year, and half of that was in the final quarter of last year. And Chris, you're closer to this than I am, so you've probably seen that firsthand in terms of the spike of interest. That's number one. Number two, I look at the world through cloud-colored glasses. The reason Chris and I have converged is I've been all about the cloud for a long time, and I feel just like with big data, we wouldn't have talked about big data if the cloud wasn't there to do something about it. We wouldn't be talking about the Internet of Things if it weren't for the cloud to provide us the connectivity, the ability to capture data, the ability to collate that data, the ability to share that data. If I'm on a board, I would be asking, or if I'm an investor, I would be asking, what are we doing to leverage the cloud to support this business and to help us to scale that business? And how are we using cloud service concepts, subscription services, like anything as a service, to sell our value as opposed to trying to sell it as a commoditized product? Where's the value add? What Brendan has done to create a value add around a very mundane product, technology, is the greatest example of that that I've seen in a long time. And having it right here in our backyard, I think, is really important. The other thing I'll say, again, about our backyard is I've spent a lot of time on the West Coast, and my wife probably has appreciated that because we're now married 30 years because I spent most of my time there rather than here. But now she's getting a little concerned because I'm spending too much time here because there's so much stuff going on in the Boston area. The roots of this industry are here in Boston, with everything that's happened around communications and M2M and a lot of other technologies. And you're going to see even more coming out of this area over the years to come.
This is for any of the panelists before we take some questions. In the coming year, some of the big companies, of course, are thinking about IoT. What kind of activities do you, and developments, transactions, do you expect to see as sort of the headlines next year? What's going to happen?
I'll throw a couple of things out. I've been talking about this conversion of consumer-oriented IoT devices, the Fitbits and all the rest, to a commercial application of those. And we're seeing them every day. The most recent example that you'll begin to see is a yoga mat that allows you the yoga practitioner to measure their every movement during a yoga session. They can measure the pressure you're putting on various spots on that mat. And they can give you, like Strava does for the cyclist, they can give you all the measurements. And not only will you be able to measure your day-to-day progress, but of course measure how you compare and contrast with your peers. Now imagine that same mat in a commercial or industrial environment, on the floor in this room, or in your office, or in your warehouse, or in your grocery store, measuring the movement across that floor to either save money or produce new revenue opportunities, save lives, or possibly enhance their movements. There are those kinds of applications, if you will, of this technology across every industry that will not only make your hair go on fire, but it will make your head explode. I mean, the way I look at this is, as soon as you're exposed to this, and Chris helped me get exposed to it a little bit more than a year ago, you don't walk down the street without looking at everything around you entirely differently about how it can be connected and the possibilities for what you can do to make it of greater value, or at least reducing the friction of your day-to-day life. So it's very exciting.
So saying it changes everything is really an oversimplification.
Absolutely.
You're still going to worry about competitive advantage. You're still going to worry about corporate finance strategy.
The old rules still apply.
Brendan.
So we're dealing with a lot of the large tech giants, and one of the points of view that we're seeing that they have is that the 100 of us in this room, we're all walking around with supercomputers. We never thought about it. It was a phone, but it really is a supercomputer by any definition that we can have. And what we're seeing is, we're putting 8-bit processors on fire extinguishers. Not a lot of processing power in our devices right now. But what happens when you can put a supercomputer on a salt shaker, and the cost of doing so is irrelevant, so why don't you do it anyway? And this idea of pushing processing to the edge in areas where you can push processing to the edge is really what some of these large corporations are really interested in today. So to Chris's point earlier, I know a number of you folks are intermediaries or in M&A, and if there are companies that you're working with, if you're working with a mattress manufacturer from Gardner and they're not putting a chip in their mattress or have a path to put a chip in their mattress, somebody is out there thinking about how to completely disrupt that business. And there will come a point where we will think it's crazy not to buy a mattress that doesn't have a chip in it to help us sleep better. I mean, I know that's an odd example. I just kind of pulled it out, but that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at and go, well, you can put a supercomputer in it. Why don't we do it? And we're just going to see that type of thing. So these large companies that are doing M&A, they're really looking at devices and types of things that can push large amounts of processing to the edge.
We're all going to be wearing GoPros as we go to sleep. Dave and Chris, any thoughts on that? Headlines that we're going to see next year in M&A corporate finance?
I think you're going to continue to see people try to get footprint into new places where they haven't been, right? So Google buying Nest to get into the home, Samsung buying smart things to drive connectivity in new places. And if you think about all of the big tech guys, they're going to try to figure out how to have a sort of innocuous looking first step, sort of a Trojan horse into the lab or the bathroom or the bedroom or wherever, right? I mean, the ability to get information that can then be used in many different ways, and represent a platform upon which you can layer additional services and additional things you can measure. Why else would Nest be worth $3.2 billion, right? It was very sort of small footprint, but, cleverly architected. And, there's sort of a superset of sensors that's inside there it has a lot more in it than a typical thermostat.
Chris, headlines for next year?
Boy. I think the biggest headline is going to be an explicit recognition with evidence that leadership in the instrumentation of the physical world, or IoT, will not come primarily, and certainly not exclusively, out of the traditional centers of tech and finance. I think that there will be multiple centers of excellence and leadership in the instrumentation of the physical world. I'm betting my intellectual, professional, and financial future on the fact that Boston will be among them. And I'm also working my tail off with our teams to make sure that the culture of Boston as I know it, my dad built or renovated maybe a third of downtown Boston with John Fish at Suffolk Construction Company, is that values are going to drive value. Valuation is not going to drive value. Values are. What do I mean? These are all cool examples, but I can get a little bit Pollyanna-ish, and I apologize. But my favorite investment, my favorite company in our portfolio, and maybe I shouldn't say that, and maybe Mr. Caruso, you'll coach me on this, but is a company called WellIntel. And they do one thing: multi-frequency, sonar sensor, low energy, that you install on the top of your private vertical artesian water well in your home. If your home gets its water from a private well, you want one of these. Here's why. Because we don't know where the groundwater is on the planet Earth. We don't know. We have thousands of satellites with geospatial intelligence, sensors, hyperspectral, all kinds of sensing and instrumentation to tell us about surface moisture, but not about groundwater. It's all inferential. We have no ground truth. We don't know where the water is until we pull it out of the ground, and then it's too late. It's like using bees as sensors for toxic pollen. Once the bee dies, it's too late to understand that you've got toxic pollen somewhere. So here's what I think is going to happen. Projects like WellIntel, which will help us get ground truth on where the water is in an aquifer before we pull it, before we create policy, before we create rates, will be the model going forward. We will look at assets that matter. We will look at instrumentations that are intelligent. We will look at data models that are expansive. And we'll start to get back to the things that really matter. No offense to any of these, but when you think about 7 billion going to 9, I think about water more than I think about oil and gas. I think about Maslow's hierarchy. I think about the base of the pyramid more than I think about the top. And I don't think that those values are separate from the fact that I grew up a Portuguese kid in a mill town in New England just outside Boston.
Terrific. Values driving valuation. We have time for a few questions. In the front or the back? Right here.
I thought the CVS example was interesting, but I think that, correct me or you can have different opinions on this, the challenge there is to do enough intelligent deciphering of what the opportunities are to add value. There's a huge workload in there for that to be successful. There's always a few top, oh, we can do this for the consumer, but that gets tiresome pretty quickly. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the dirty little secret of the Internet of Things, it's really hard work. It is really, really hard. You have to install stuff and pull cables, and you have to figure out value propositions, and it's hard. So there's a lot of, we're going to see an awful lot of failed companies who think it's easy. And we've already, every time I go out to an event I was out in Palo Alto and met with a small little company in Santa Clara, a brilliant group of young guys. I mean, gosh, they were just so smart. And their chances of success, because they couldn't figure out the sign of the hard work, is about zero. And this is, you're exactly right. I mean, we're gonna take friction out of the retail experience. We're gonna take friction out of the hotel experience, the hospital experience, all these things. But it's gonna be really hard work to do it.
2 points. One, integrating all the piece parts. The piece parts are all out there. And the economics of the piece parts are very attractive. That's why everybody's talking about this. Pulling them together, the integration of those for a use case like this is the first challenge. The second one, which you alluded to, is what the heck to do with the data. We can capture the data, but there are companies spending millions of dollars trying to figure out what data to use and how to use it in a cost-effective fashion. And I saw an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, based on some study talking about data scientists, finding the right data scientists. But my point is we need less data scientists and more systems that allow real people to use the data. So those are the two issues that are the biggest impediments to success for the IoT, I think.
Next question.
I'm more a communication expert than an IoT expert. And so my question to you is there a limitation in the devices presently used to transfer the information from the sensors to the people who are using the information. Are these devices too expensive? Are these devices too large? Is the performance in terms of speed limiting it or limiting the opportunity to grow this business faster?
Terrific. The question for those in the back is about the limitations of the product in the IoT. Are they too small? Are they? I mean, we know that the internet IoT products require a few things, right? The hardware, the connectivity.
Sure. So most people conceive of connectivity or communications in the Internet of Things in one of two ways. They think about cellular, M2M, 2G, 3G, 4G, or they think about short-range Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. That's correct. The vast majority of connections today are, in fact, M2M, Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth. However, I believe that going forward, the vast majority of connections won't be in necessarily cellular, Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth. Bluetooth, the range is too short in many cases. Wi-Fi, power hungry. And cellular, just too damn expensive. So again, my bias, we're paying a lot of attention to something called sub-gigahertz or something called weightless. The quick tutorial is this. The same people that created the Bluetooth special interest group that enabled Bluetooth to become this global standard to be deployed seamlessly with no friction in a ubiquitous way, William Webb and his crew from Cambridge Silicon Radio, which Qualcomm just purchased for $3 or $4 billion, that same crew got bored when they left Cambridge Silicon Radio, and they created the weightless special interest group to focus on doing the same thing, create a global, seamless, rapid adoption standard for something called sub-gigahertz frequencies, specifically 915 megahertz here in the States, or 868 in Europe, or better yet, I promise I'll stop in a minute, 700 megahertz to 750 megahertz, which is a huge investment opportunity. It's called Band 14 or FirstNet. All fire, police, EMT will be given 700 to 750 megahertz, and the rest of us need to get out. And then below that is the old TV white space, from 500 megahertz to 700 megahertz, and then below that, really low frequency, really low power, really long range, really low cost. So what's the point? I think the future will be about having a secure, software-defined radio implementation that's optimized probably for all frequencies sub-gigahertz. But don't be fooled thinking it's got to be satellite, or it's got to be cellular, or it's got to be Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, because we have projects today and markets today that are going to explode, and the killer lever will be sub-gig. Because if you can get 5 or 10 kilometers and only pay $1 a month for your service fee, or $2 a month for your connectivity and service fee, that destroys the economics of the M2M space, where you have to pay an average of $75 a module and $40 a month for connectivity. So the tools are there, the technical tools are there, but most of the connectivity methods are inappropriate. Either you have to spend too much on infrastructure for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, or you have lots of limitations in a campus, in a building, or you have to spend way too much money on the radios and the connectivity in a satellite or cellular space. Enter this stuff called weightless. You get long range, at low power, at low cost. I hope that helps.
I'm sold on that platform.
The other big challenge here is, that cannot be ignored is battery. Battery power continues, just like this new Apple Watch and the problems we all have with our phones. Battery continues to be one of the biggest hurdles. We're doing a lot of testing of energy harvesting, but it's still a long way off to get rid of a battery.
Question in the back.
Yes, I have a question. You've been talking mainly about the corporate implementation of IoT. What are your feelings about the government entering into the space and some of the legal ramifications about gathering, information about citizens?
Back to security and questions about implementation of the IoT and the government, not corporations, learning more about us than perhaps we'd like them to.
So don't be fooled. NSA can't see or find anything digital, period, the end, full stop. They may not have persistent access to it, but they've either had access to it, they have access to it, or they can get access to it, first point. Look, there are a lot of brilliant and amazing people coming out of the military with operating experience in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other parts of the world that people don't talk about. Nod to my brother, Ranger qualified, is in the Army today. Thank God for him. Here's the deal. Those people are coming out into private industry, and they're bringing new rules with them about how to deploy this stuff. So for me, when you say public sector, I think I want those people in our businesses because they understand mission critical. And I'll just leave you with one concept. The concept is called glance. When you're in the intelligence community or the special operations forces community, you don't want your face in a screen. You want your eyes in the physical world, looking at other people, looking at bad guys, looking at things you're supposed to be looking at. In every one of our startups, we obsess about that. Our critical success criteria is if people are not in our applications very often, that's a good sign. And when they are in them, if they get in, get their value and get out, that's an even better sign. Now, I think more technology is going to come out of the government than spending. Now, at the same time, we have a project that's received over $1 million in Department of Transportation RETA grants to help us develop a sensor stack for surface transportation. I think there'll be a lot of that coming. But neither the feds nor the states want to own or fund the deployment of those assets. Why? Because they know that there's private industry value to be created from knowing moisture, temperature, frost heave, freeze or slick, or thaw sinkhole on 195 or 24 or 128. So you have these private individuals coming out of the public sector, and many of them coming out of the intelligence and defense community, serving as chief information officers, geospatial intelligence officers, here in the state of Massachusetts or in Colorado. These people know what's available, they know the value that can be created, so they'll fund the development out of the federal or state level, but they're not going to fund the deployment of the infrastructure because they know that those of us that are developing can make a killing on the back end in the private industry. So I don't look to the federal sector or the private or the state sector or even the municipal sector to be a significant source of revenue, but I do expect it to be a significant driver of innovation.
I also, our technology is deployed in a number of government settings, and because we have a sensor chassis that we can put all sorts of sensors on it. The example I can use, in New York, if you walk around New York right now, you will see sensor stations on the sidewalks around the city. They are collecting information on biological, chemical weapons, radiation, and others. There's also the ability to sniff narcotics at those locations with that technology. In the city of New York and the FBI, who actually was originally deploying those, they actually shut that feature off. So they weren't looking for that. So there's the government, in my experience with what we've done with the government so far, is they're making good choices on what they're using sensors for.
And by the way, to turn the security question around even further, you look at some cities, New York included, they originally put that technology out for security reasons. Unfortunately, a lot of bad guys doing bad things out there. But then they also realized they could monitor traffic patterns and change the light sequences in order to take advantage of the same technology. So there are ways to take a negative and turn it into a positive.
I think the public sector is going to, I think the Internet of Things is going to enable, our concept is called privateer. We think there's going to be a renaissance in privatization of public sector assets and operations, and we think the IoT is going to enable it. Why? Because the IoT develops ground truth on the assets, the inventories, the areas of operation. You have data, objective, independent, and that can engender more trust because you have a verification tool. So I get the smart cities thing, I do, but we don't look toward municipalities or state level spending to support the projects we're working on. We look at them as an enabler.
And we'll go ahead and leave it there. There's plenty of coffee and refreshments. I want to thank Jeff, Dave, Chris, and Brendan for the really thoughtful comments. Take a look at thinkstrategies.com, pick up a microswipe, galawpartners.com for register for events, and also suggest topics for other events. I want to thank our panelists and thank you for coming. See you next time.